So what do you think we should do about Islamist terrorism? I mean, it's a tough question. Some of the brightest minds of our generation are trying to figure out the answer. Well, if you think it's tough to figure out, imagine being a political decision maker. I mean, you get advice from all sides, and that advice is from experts, and yet it's contradictory. Even some of your security and intelligence reports are contradictory, and often you can't split the difference or compromise. I mean, you've got to make a clear choice. Take the question of Syria's civil war. Do you commit troops, as some suggest, or not? There's really not a halfway answer to a lot of these questions. And you can't just kick the can down the road and ignore it or fake it. I mean, that's the difference between being a pundit or armchair quarterback, someone watching the show in the bleachers, versus being a decider, the man in the arena doing things. It's also part of the difference between being in opposition, where you can criticize without true responsibility, versus being in power, when your decisions may cost or save lives. It's fascinating to watch Barack Obama's evolution since becoming president. Nowhere is it more evident than in the war on terror. Despite his peacenik rhetoric back in 2008, and in fact even since he became president, he has not shut down Guantanamo Bay, which he said would be his first order of business. And he's ramped up the number of drone strikes. I guess it's the difference between being play fighting in opposition and real fighting as president. There can be no more serious decision than those involving war and peace and terrorism. It's the first responsibility of any government to defend its national sovereignty and the security of its citizens, which is why Justin Trudeau's answer to the Boston Marathon bombing was so pathetic and weak and unprepared. It's as if he hadn't spent a minute in his whole life thinking about what he'd do if he actually stopped being a carefree Peter Pan just for a moment and was given our top job. Here, remember what he told Peter Mansbridge that day.
We have to look at the root causes. There is no question that this happened because there is someone who feels completely excluded. But we also need to make sure that as we go forward, we don't emphasize a culture of fear and mistrust.
Now, that was about 6 weeks ago, and Trudeau was roundly mocked for his lightweight answer. Surely he talked to his policy experts. He has policy experts, right? Not just hairstyle experts and moisturizer experts and fashion experts, right? Well, last week there was another startling terrorist attack in the heart of London, England. This one accompanied by a 2-minute rant by the terrorist, hands covered in blood, talking about an Islamist war against the West. He said it to a cell phone camera. Now, he didn't mention Canada, this terrorist, but he talked about Afghanistan, where we have Canadian soldiers. And the terrorist himself was born in the West. He was a convert to Islam who became an extremist. Now, all of these matters affect Canada, too. We've had dozens of terrorists arrested in our own country. Thank God, before they've hacked someone to pieces. Our own Chris Sims put a simple question to Justin Trudeau the other day about this new London terrorist. Now, unlike Peter Mansbridge's question that we showed you the answer to, it wasn't just hours after the Boston bombing. It was days after this London stabbing. Surely Trudeau had a briefing on the matter, had read some essays or even newspaper columns on the subject. Surely he had a few thoughts of his own. So here's what he told Chris.
One of the things that we have to look at is the fact that this was a horrible tragedy that woke up an awful lot of people who are very worried about the fact that there is uncertainty and instability in the world. What we have to do is reassure people that we're willing to keep them safe, that we're willing to do what's right to make sure that citizens of free countries around the world remain safe, and that's what we talk about now. I mean, we can look for ways to heal and move forward, but fundamentally the priority needs to be to keep people safe in both the short term and the long term, and there's a lot of things to do around that.
Look, as you know from my own delivery, it's tough to speak in public, but this was not a trick question. It wasn't a surprise question. It was about the leading news story in the whole world for days. It's led to copycat attacks in Britain and France. This is serious stuff. But you'd think by all his humming 17 or 18 times in less than a minute, to be exact, that he hadn't given a moment's thought to it. Or if he had, it was all his usual banalities about us all getting along and not excluding anybody. His same answer he gave to Peter Mansbridge. I think his stammering was half cluelessness and half fear of saying something he normally does, that he normally gets away with because he loves to speak at high schools or cougar conventions or other love-ins where nobody really expects him to talk about anything serious, so they don't pay too much attention. But he did squeeze out a few words. He called the murder here a tragedy, I suppose it is a tragedy. I suppose you could say that about any death, any murder even. I think Trudeau meant to use the word tragedy as something really, really sad, but I don't think that's really what Trudeau meant. I think he just meant someone being killed is really, really sad. I would have preferred him to say outrage since it wasn't an accidental beheading, but let's give him the benefit of the doubt. What tragic lessons can we learn here? Well, Trudeau says a lot of people are worried about uncertainty and instability in the world. Okay, and that's the government's job to keep them safe. He just can't help himself from using his Hallmark card Oprah Winfrey words. We could look for ways to heal. That's what he said. But he says there are a lot of things to be done about keeping people safe. Okay, now I'd say that's an improvement over his sympathy for the terrorist remarks he told Mansbridge. But other than restraining himself from talking about root causes that would turn a privileged British-born citizen into a bloodthirsty jihadist, what has Trudeau told us there? That we need to do a lot of things, but what things? Any ideas? Even one, even a hint? If he were Prime Minister and chairing an emergency cabinet meeting after, God forbid, such an event happened in Canada, what would his cabinet ministers take away from those remarks? What direction would they go? Surely his staff and cabinet would have conflicting suggestions to him. Well, which suggestions would he choose? Imagine if he received a briefing from CSIS and the RCMP and maybe the Department of Foreign Affairs. They'd give him information and then they'd ask him for a direction or a decision. It would be a bit like a child king, play acting as the decider while seasoned and experienced men of the world bit their tongues around him. I don't know if you've seen that TV show Game of Thrones, but Justin Trudeau would be like that boy king Joffrey if Joffrey were beautiful instead of mean. Joffrey's uncle and grandfather make the real decisions in that show. Do you think you could run a country based on Trudeau's Peter Pan blather? Forget foreign affairs for a moment. Trudeau obviously hasn't thought a lot about those issues for a moment, even though he was 30 years old when 9/11 happened, and like the rest of us, he's had a dozen years to come to grips with Islamic terrorism. But how about Quebec and the West and the Constitution? Surely that's something he's heard about, maybe even remembers his father talking about. Surely he has some theory or vision, right or wrong, at least he's thought it through and can articulate it. Well, yesterday I told you about his remarks made in Quebec in French, saying how we don't want Senate reform because the current Senate, which gives Quebec 24 seats to just 6 each for BC and Alberta, is to our advantage. He's clearly identifying himself as a Quebecer first, and clearly stating he wants Quebec to remain privileged and advantaged within Confederation, and that if he gets the keys to the castle, he'll make it an inside job to keep it that way for us being his favorite province. Well, he was pressed about that yesterday in Parliament. Again, he'd had days to think about his remarks, to get advice, to get some talking points, to have the grown-ups in his world give him some help. But here's what he said instead.
I have a confession to make. It's something I was hoping to distract or hide from throughout my political career, but since my opponents are using it against me, I will admit I am a Quebecer, and from time to time, when I am speaking with Quebecers, I might use the word we. However, in my choices of policy, in my approach to this country, I have always spoken for and to and with all Canadians, and I will continue to.
Is that it? He said he doesn't want Senate reform right now because Quebec has an advantage over the West. And he was pressed on it there. And that's what he's got. I suppose it's better than his foreign affairs terrorism blather in that at least it takes a stand. Damn right I'm a Quebecer first and foremost. I suppose he is being firm. Yeah, he's saying me and Quebec are best friends and me and the rest of the country are more like, you know, Facebook friends. And yeah, I stand by my statement to keep Quebec more powerful than the West, and, you know, it's a surprise to you. At least that's what I think he's saying. I'm not quite sure. The Conservatives have attacked Trudeau, not for being left-wing or soft on terror or even biased towards Quebec, though he is all of those things. They've simply said something that I think is increasingly indisputable, that Trudeau is in over his head. He has no clue how to fix the grand problems of our time. For a few issues, he remembers some liberal cliches that he probably heard his dad say 20 years ago, fogged through a child's memory. Isn't it lucky for him, then, that at precisely the same time that a vacuous clothes horse presents himself as a stylistic alternative to the current Prime Minister, that the media party decides that's what they care about now, actually. And the media party pivots. No more boring talk about policy or principles, no more substance or boring policy conferences. It's now about Twitter followers and Facebook friends and posing for iPhone photos with reporters. Harper is steak, but Trudeau is sizzle. So the media party turns too. The recent foofara over Rob Ford, the unsourced, unnamed gossip mongers running rumors on the front pages without corroboration, I think it's part of this shift. It's high school again, and it's about cheering for the cool kids and being mean to the Squaresville nerds like Stephen Harper or the fat kids like those Ford brothers. The Liberals elected Peter Pan as their leader. He's a child, and when asked a grown-up question, he either sounds very scared, like on terrorism, or very angry, like on Quebec. But the media party will cover for him. After all, there's probably some politician out there who smoked a joint back in high school, which will be front-page news, as long as he's a conservative.